5 ungrateful children buried their elderly mother alive, but hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch Mrs. Mary had spent her entire life sacrificing to raise her 5 children. Michael, Helen, Lucas, Emily, and Daniel. She had once been a strong, loving mother, but the years had taken their toll. Her shoulders had hunched, her hands trembled, and her health was gradually declining. That winter morning, Mrs. Mary sat by the window gazing out at the cobblestone street in front of her house. A cold gust of wind slipped through the cracks in the door, making her shiver. Slightly she pulled her old woolen shawl closer, and sighed. It had been months since she had last seen her children come to visit. A knock on the door echoed through the house. Mrs. Mary, a cheerful voice called out. Mrs. Mary struggled to her feet and walked over to open the door. It was Rose, the young neighbor, holding a basket of freshly baked bread. I brought you some bread. I just finished baking it this morning, Rose said with a warm smile. Mrs. Mary gave her a faint smile. Thank you, dear Rose, you're always so kind. Rose set the basket on the table and pulled out a chair. Are you doing okay? It's so cold today, and I was worried you might be lonely. Mrs. Mary nodded slightly. I'm fine, it's just I haven't seen the children lately. Rose fell silent. She had heard the villagers whispering about Mrs. Mary's children. Everyone knew they were trying to sell this house, paying no mind to their aging mother. Would you like me to call them for you? Rose hesitated. Mrs. Mary shook her head. No need, dear. If they want to come, they will come on their own. Rose bit her lip, unsure of what to say. Just then the doorbell rang. Mrs. Mary slowly walked over and opened the door. Standing before her was Michael, her eldest son, looking composed but with a cold expression. Beside him were Lucas and Emily. Michael, you've come to visit me? Her voice was full of hope. Michael nodded, but did not smile. Mother, we need to talk. They stepped inside and sat at the table. Rose quietly stood up, bowed slightly to Mrs. Mary, and left. Michael rested his arms on the table and spoke in an even tone. Mother, we've talked it over. It's not safe for you to live alone like this. Your health is declining, so it would be best for you to move into a nursing home. Mrs. Mary was stunned. A nursing home? Lucas spoke next, his tone gentler. Yes, Mother, there will be doctors and caretakers there. You won't have to worry about anything. Emily nodded. That's right, Mom, it's too cold and lonely here. We're just worried about you. Mrs. Mary looked at her children, searching for sincerity in their words, but as her heart sank, she realized this wasn't concern, it was reject. I don't want to go anywhere. Her voice trembled. Michael sighed. Mother, you can't live alone forever, but this is my home. Michael leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. You won't be around much longer, so why should we have to carry this burden indefinitely? A sharp pain pierced Mrs. Mary's heart. The children she had once cradled, for whom she had sacrificed everything, now saw her as nothing more than a burden. Am I really just a burden to you? Lucas lowered his gaze. Emily avoided her mother's eyes. Only Michael remained cold and indifferent. This is the best decision for everyone, Michael concluded. Mrs. Mary turned to Daniel, her youngest son, who had been standing silently in the corner. Daniel, what do you think? Daniel flinched, looking uneasy. I don't know. Michael shot Daniel a sharp look, a silent warning. Mrs. Mary swallowed her tears. So you've all made up your minds, haven't you? No one answered. Mrs. Mary took a deep breath. Then I have made up my mind as well. I am not going anywhere. Michael abruptly stood up. Mother, don't be stubborn. If you don't go willingly, we'll have to find another way. Mrs. Mary looked at her son, her heart aching. This was the child she had once cherished, the one she had placed all her trust in, and now he was trying to force her out of her own home. I'm tired, Mrs. Mary said softly. Go home. Michael scowled, then gestured for Lucas and Emily to leave. Before stepping out the door, he turned back to glance at his mother one last time. Sooner or later you'll have to leave. The door closed. Mrs. Mary stood, frozen, tears rolling down her cheeks. The house that had once been warm now felt unbearably cold. The house fell into silence after the children left. Mrs. Mary sat motionless in her chair, her gaze unfocused. As she looked out the window, the pale afternoon sunlight crept through the cracks in the door, but her heart remained as dark as her fate. She had sacrificed her entire life for her children, working tirelessly, enduring hunger and hardship to raise them, and yet now they were discussing sending her to a nursing home, as if she were nothing more than an old, useless object. Mrs. Mary clenched her wrinkled hands, her heart aching. She couldn't believe that Michael, the eldest son she had trusted the most, was the one who had made this decision. A knock on the door broke the silence. It was Rose. Mrs. Mary, the first brought you some soup. Mrs. Mary forced a weak smile. Thank you, dear. Rose placed the bowl of soup on the table, observing the frail look on Mrs. Mary's face. Are you okay? Mrs. Mary didn't answer right away. After a long pause, she sighed. What do you think about a mother Being abandoned by her own children, Rose gently took Mrs. Mary's hand. I can't even imagine it. Mrs. Mary gave a sad smile. Neither could I until now. Rose looked down at the bowl of soup, her heart heavy. She wanted to help Mrs. Mary, but she was just a young woman. What power did she have over someone else's family? Matters suddenly. Voices and laughter echoed from outside. Michael had returned. He walked into the house as if he already owned it. With him were Helen, Lucas, and Emily. We need to talk, Michael said. Mrs. Mary straightened her back. I've already told you I'm not going anywhere. Michael chuckled coldly. Mother, don't be stubborn. We've already consulted with a lawyer. You can't stay in this house alone forever. Helen spoke next, her voice gentler. Mother, we think the best option is to sell the house. That way you'll have money for your retirement, and we won't have to worry. Mrs. Mary looked at each of her children, her heart tightening. You mean you want to sell my house? Michael smirked. Exactly, Lucas added. Mother, we need money too. We all have our own families, our own lives. And what about me? Mrs. Mary choked up. I sacrificed my whole life for you. And now this is how you treat me? Emily shrugged. Don't say it like that. We're just trying to find the best solution. The best solution for whom? For me or for you? Michael stood up, pressing his hands on the table. Mother, stop making this difficult. If you sign the papers to sell the house, you'll have money, and we'll get our share that way. Everyone wins. Mrs. Mary let out a bitter laugh. I see now I'm just a commodity for you to divide among yourselves. Daniel, who had been silent the entire time, suddenly spoke. Michael, maybe we should reconsider this. Michael whipped around, eyes blazing with anger. Shut up. Are you taking her side? Daniel lowered his head, saying nothing more. Mrs. Mary looked at her youngest son, and her heart ached even more. Michael sighed and pulled out a stack of documents. Mother, these are the sale papers. All you have to do is sign, and everything will be settled. Mrs. Mary stared at the documents without touching them. Michael pushed the papers toward her. Mother, don't make us force you. Mrs. Mary raised her head, her eyes firm. I will not sign. Michael narrowed his eyes. Do you think you have a choice? Mrs. Mary slowly stood up. This is my house. If you no longer respect me, then leave. Michael laughed mockingly. Fine, but you'll change your mind soon enough. He got up, motioning for Helen, Lucas, and Emily to follow. Before stepping out the door, he turned back to Daniel. You too, let's go. Daniel hesitated for a moment before lowering his head and walking out after them. The door closed. Mrs. Mary stood there alone in the empty house. Tears quietly fell down her face. The next morning, she woke up with swollen eyes, red from crying all night. The house, once silent, now felt colder than ever. She quietly prepared a simple breakfast, one hard piece of bread and a cup of cold coffee, but she couldn't swallow. Michael's words still echoed in her mind. You won't be around much longer. So why should we carry this burden forever? Never in her life had she thought that the children she bore and raised could say such things. A sudden knock on the door startled her this time. It wasn't Rose. Michael stood there, arms crossed over his chest, with Lucas and Emily behind him. Without needing to hear a word, Mrs. Mary already knew what was coming. It's time to go, Mother, Michael said firmly. Mrs. Mary frowned. Go where? Emily tried to smile gently. Mother, we found a really nice place for you. Horizon Senior Care in the suburbs, very quiet and well-equipped. Lucas nodded. You'll have friends, nurses to take care of you, and you won't be lonely anymore. Mrs. Mary set her coffee cup down, her voice growing cold. So you've already made the decision for me? Michael sighed, sounding impatient. Mother, there's no need to argue anymore. All the paperwork is done. You just need to get in the car and everything will be settled. Mrs. Mary stood up, looking at each of her children. Do you have even a shred of love left for me? Emily avoided her mother's gaze. Lucas stared at the floor. Only Michael stood tall, unaffected. Michael stepped closer and placed hand on her shoulder. Mother, please don't make this harder on us. Mrs. Mary jerked her arm away. I'm not going anywhere. No one had expected someone so old and frail to be so resolute. Michael suddenly let out a smirk. If you won't go willingly, we have other ways. With that, he signaled to Lucas and Emily. The two quickly moved forward, grabbing Mrs. Mary by the arms. Let me go, Mrs. Mary cried out, struggling desperately. I'm sorry, Mother, but this is the only way. Lucas said, his voice filled with guilt. Michael opened the door. A car was already waiting outside. Stop resisting. You'll feel better once you're there. But Mrs. Mary didn't believe him. Her trembling hands clung tightly to the doorframe. I'm begging you, don't do this. Michael ignored her and pulled her away forcefully. Mother, it's just for a little while. You'll get used to it, Emily said. But even she couldn't look her mother in the eye. They shoved her into the car and slammed the door shut. Mrs. Mary burst into tears, but her tears did nothing to stop Michael. The car sped away, leaving behind the home she had lived in her entire life. About an hour later, the car came to a stop. Mrs. Mary opened her eyes, trying to recognize her Surroundings, this was not a nursing home. All around her was a desolate forest. With towering trees blocking out the sky in front of her stood a small dilapidated house, its wooden walls peeling, its windows covered in mold, and its roof on the verge of collapse. Michael opened the car door and dragged his mother outside. Where is this Mrs. Mary?" asked, her voice trembling. Michael smirked. "You said you didn't want to go to a nursing home, so this is the best place for you." Mrs. Mary stood frozen. You brought me here." Lucas turned away. Emily lowered her head. Michael remained indifferent. "This is an old family house. You'll live here. No one will bother you. And you won't bother anyone." Mrs. Mary stared at the ruined house before her, utterly dazed. "This is your solution?" she asked. Michael shrugged. "You didn't want to go far." We honored that. Mrs. Mary let out a bitter laugh. "So you're dumping me here to rid yourselves of responsibility?" Michael did not deny it. Lucas muttered, "Mother, you'll be fine. It's peaceful here. No one will disturb you." Emily handed Mrs. Mary a small bag. "There's food in here if you need anything. Just call us." Mrs. Mary took the bag, her hands trembling. "Really, if I call, will you come?" "No one answered." Finally, Michael patted Lucas and Emily on the back. "Let's go." They turned and walked toward the car. "I hope you all have happy lives," Mrs. Mary said, her voice heavy with sorrow. No one looked back. The car sped away, leaving her alone in the middle of the abandoned forest. Mrs. Mary looked around. The wind howled through the trees, the silence eerie and suffocating. She opened the door to the house, and a stench of mold hit her, making her cough violently. The house was empty, just an old broken bed, a table with a missing leg, and a few scattered belongings. Mrs. Mary collapsed to the floor. In the end, she had been abandoned by the very children she had brought into the world. Tears streamed down her face. No one could hear her cries. In the midst of this desolate forest, Mrs. Mary sat motionless on the old rickety bed, her empty gaze fixed on the dust-covered window. The wind howled through the trees outside, creating a mournful sound that echoed the sorrow in her heart. 3 days had passed since her children abandoned her here. This decrepit wooden house in the middle of the wilderness was no place for a person to live. The wooden walls were rotting, the ceiling had large holes, and whenever it rained, water poured through the gaps, drenching the cold, dirt-covered floor. Her meals consisted only of hardened pieces of bread and a few canned goods that Emily had left behind, but now the food was almost gone. Mrs. Mary trembled as she walked to the small cupboard in the corner of the room, opening it with the hope of finding something, anything edible, but inside there was nothing but old junk covered in cobwebs. Her stomach growled with hunger. She picked up the last piece of stale bread, chewing it bit by bit, but it was so hard that it got stuck in her throat. She took a sip of the little water left in her bottle, struggling to swallow. She was growing weaker. For the first time in her life, she felt as though she was on the brink of death. That afternoon, the sky darkened, and the rain began to fall. Heavy raindrops pounded against the broken roof, seeping through the cracks and dripping onto the floor in slow, steady streams. Mrs. Mary curled up in the corner of the bed, wrapping her frail body tightly in her old woolen shawl, but the cold still seeped deep into her bones. Outside, the sound of insects filled the night. In the distance, the eerie howling of stray dogs echoed through the trees. Mrs. Mary closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but sleep never came. Instead, memories flooded back. She remembered the old days when her little home in Evergreen was always filled with the laughter of children. She remembered Michael as a child, always running after her. Whenever she went to the market, he used to hold her hand tightly, innocently asking, "Mom, I'll always be with you, right?" She had smiled, tenderly stroking his hair. "Of course, my love." And yet now it was Michael who had heartlessly pushed her out of his life. She remembered Helen, her eldest daughter, who used to cling to her side whenever she cooked as a little girl. Helen would hug her tightly before bed, whispering, "Mom, I love you more than anything in the world." But now Helen had joined Michael in taking away the home she had built. She remembered Lucas, Emily, and Daniel, but now they had all abandoned her. Tears streamed down her face. The next morning, Mrs. Mary woke up with a sharp pain in her back. The old stiff mattress was too hard, making it impossible for her to sleep. While she looked out the window, the faint morning sunlight filtered through the trees, but it was not enough to warm her. She needed to find water. With what little strength she had left, she slowly stood up, draped a thin knitted sweater over her frail body, and stepped outside. The ground was slippery after the rain from the night before. Mrs. Mary carefully stepped forward, navigating through the muddy path, searching for a water source. In the distance, she spotted a small stream flowing through the forest. She forced her aching legs to move, each step sending sharp pain through her knees. Eventually, she reached the stream. She bent down, cupping her trembling hands to scoop up the water and drink. The cool liquid soothed her dry throat, but she had no container to Bring any back. Mrs. Mary looked around hoping to find something useful, but all she saw were rocks and broken branches. She sighed and continued to drag herself back to the abandoned house. That afternoon, as she sat huddled in the corner of the room, a familiar sound echoed from outside. The sound of a car. Mrs. Mary flinched, her heart pounding fast. Had her children come back? The old wooden door shook as someone knocked firmly. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob and slowly opened the door. It wasn't Michael, it wasn't Lucas, it wasn't Emily, it was Daniel, her youngest son, stood there, his posture uneasy, his eyes filled with hesitation. Daniel, Mrs. Mary choked up. Daniel looked at his mother, then glanced around at the dilapidated house. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Mother, are you okay? Mrs. Mary looked at him, unsure whether to feel relieved or heartbroken. I think you already know the answer. Daniel lowered his head. I'm sorry. Mrs. Mary studied him for a long moment. Do you truly feel remorseful? Daniel clenched his fists. Mother, I never wanted this to happen, but Michael, he forced me. Did Michael hold a knife to your throat? Silence. Mrs. Mary shook her head slightly. You stayed silent while they abandoned me, so why are you here now? Daniel bit his lip. I just wanted to see if you were okay. Mrs. Mary let out a laugh, but it was a laugh full of pain. Would you feel relieved if I were dead? Daniel shook his head violently. No, Mother, don't say that. Mrs. Mary's voice turned cold. If you truly cared, you wouldn't have let this happen. Daniel said nothing. He stood there lost for words. At last he sighed. Mother, I can't go against Michael, but I'll try. I'll find a way to help you. Mrs. Mary looked at him, her heart heavy. Did he truly want to help, or was this just the last shred of guilt gnawing at his conscience? Either way, she no longer believed in empty promises. She turned away and stepped back into the house. Go home. Daniel stood motionless for a long time. Finally he sighed, turned around, got into his car, and drove away. Mrs. Mary sat down, her gaze distant. She no longer expected anything. She knew she was truly alone. Daniel's car disappeared into the distance, leaving behind a thin veil of dust on the dirt road leading into the forest. Mrs. Mary remained seated on the doorstep, watching quietly. Her breathing was heavy, not from exhaustion, but from a heart that had grown too weary. Daniel had come, and yet he had left again, as if his presence had been nothing more than a fleeting breeze, too weak to soothe the pain buried deep within her. Mrs. Mary let out a bitter smile. Perhaps he had only come to ease his guilty conscience, to convince himself that he wasn't completely ungrateful, but in the end all he left her with was a vague promise, a whisper of false hope. She expected nothing anymore. Daniel drove back to town with a heavy heart. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying the image of Mrs. Mary huddled in that cold, desolate house. His mother's eyes, once filled with warmth and love, were now clouded with sorrow and disappointment. He had never felt guilt like this before. He wasn't the mastermind, but he had been silent. He had let Michael take control, had allowed selfish people like Lucas and Emily to decide their mother's fate. He hadn't spoken up. He hadn't stood by her side. He was a coward. When he arrived home, Daniel turned off the engine, but didn't step out. He sat there in the darkness, his mind blank. His phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Michael. Daniel frowned, hesitated for a moment, then pressed the answer button. What do you want? His voice was dry. I want to know what you did. Michael's voice was sharp. Daniel clenched his jaw. I didn't do anything. Then why did you go see that old woman? Daniel bit his lip. She's still our mother. Michael let out a scornful laugh. She's old, she's useless, we don't need to be with her anymore. I thought you understood that she's the one who gave birth to us. Daniel snapped, and she's also the one who could ruin everything if she keeps being stubborn. Michael replied coldly, I've already warned you, don't do anything stupid. Daniel clenched his fists. What do you think she can even do? There was silence on the other end for a moment before Michael let out a low chuckle. She won't do anything because she has no one left. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He hung up the next morning. Daniel woke up feeling drained. He had barely slept. His mother's image haunted him. He decided to go out for a walk. He wandered aimlessly through the streets of town without direction, without purpose, until he found himself standing in front of the small cafe he often visited. He pushed open the door, ordered a black coffee, and sat down in a corner. A few minutes later, a familiar voice spoke near his ear. Daniel. He looked up. It was Rose, his mother's neighbor. Rose pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her gaze sharp with scrutiny. Last night, I saw your car parked outside that house in the forest. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stared down at his cup of coffee, stirring it absent-mindedly. Rose continued, Did you go to see her? Daniel nodded, but said nothing. Rose sighed. Is she okay? Daniel looked up, conflict swirling in his eyes. What do you think? Rose pressed her lips together. You know she's not okay. If you have any conscience left, you won't let This continued. Daniel let out a bitter chuckle. And what do you think I can do? Take her back, Rose said instantly. Without hesitation, Daniel shook his head. It's not that simple. If I do that, Michael won't let it go. Rose raised an eyebrow. So you fear Michael more than you fear your own guilt? Daniel was at a loss for words. Rose shook her head and stood up. You can ignore it, but I won't. Daniel watched her walk away, feeling something burn inside him. He knew Rose was right. We keep carrying this burden. Mrs. Mary's eyes snapped open. A strong gust of wind blew past, rustling the dead branches that scraped against the broken roof. She blinked, pain radiating through every inch of her body. No, she couldn't die. Here she wouldn't let those ungrateful children get what they wanted. Gritting her teeth, she forced every last bit of strength into her limbs. Crawling back inside the house with great effort, she pushed herself up, leaning against the decaying wooden wall. Her eyes were dry. She refused to die. If fate had condemned her to suffering, then she would endure it. She would not surrender. Late at night, Daniel drove through the dark forest road, his heart burning with anxiety. He didn't know if he would make it in time. He didn't know if his mother was still alive, but he could no longer stand still when his car screeched to a stop in front of the abandoned house. Daniel jumped out without hesitation. Inside there were no lights. Mommy called out. No answer. His chest tightened. He rushed inside, his eyes scanning the room frantically, and then he saw her. Mrs. Mary was sitting against the wall, her gaze empty. Daniel ran to her, dropping to his knees. Mom, can you hear me? Slowly, Mrs. Mary turned her head to look at him. Daniel, her voice was faint. Daniel grasped her frail, cold hands, feeling the chill seep into his own skin. Mom, I'm sorry, I was wrong. Mrs. Mary said nothing, only looking at her son with weary eyes. Daniel swallowed hard, his heart aching. Mom, I'm taking you out of here, but Mrs. Mary shook her head weakly. No, Daniel, it's too late. No, it's not too late. Daniel tightened his grip. Mom, please, I won't leave you here anymore. Mrs. Mary closed her eyes. I don't believe in promises anymore. Daniel's heart shattered. He didn't know what else to say, but one thing he knew for certain. He would not let his mother die here. He would not stay silent any longer. Daniel clenched his teeth and lifted his mother into his arms. She was too light, too weak. He stepped outside the darkness, swallowing them whole. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. This time he would not abandon his mother again. The abandoned house stood eerily in the cold night. No one remained inside. Only the wind howled through the trees like the mournful cries of a mother betrayed. Dawn approached, but the cold wind still swept through the forest, carrying the dampness of the night's rain. The ground was wet with puddles, and the sky remained overcast, refusing to let the sun break through. Daniel drove down the muddy road, his grip firm on the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, Mrs. Mary rested her head against the window, her eyes closed. Her breathing was shallow, and her wrinkled skin was pale from hunger and exhaustion. He didn't know what else to do except take her back to town. He should have done this sooner. He had been silent for too long. Daniel tried to steady himself, but every beat of his heart urged him to go faster. Suddenly up ahead, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. Daniel slammed the brakes. The car jolted to a stop, barely avoiding the person standing there. The door flew open, and a startled voice called out, "My God, what's going on?" Daniel recognized her. Emma, a young woman from the village, stood there, a bundle of firewood slung over her shoulder, her face filled with concern as she looked at Daniel, and then at Mrs. Mary inside the car. Daniel rushed out. "Emma, help me, my mother, she's not okay." Emma hurried over, her eyes widening at the sight of Mrs. Mary. "Oh dear Lord, what happened to her?" Daniel lowered his head, his voice hoarse. I can't explain right now. I need help." Emma didn't hesitate. "Follow me, my house is close by, I'll help her." With no other choice, Daniel lifted his mother out of the car and followed Emma toward her small home. Emma lived in a warm house near the edge of the forest where she and her father, Mr. Peter, resided. Mr. Peter was a middle-aged man with a stern face but kind eyes. When he saw Emma leading Daniel and Mrs. Mary inside, he quickly stepped forward. "What's going on, Emma?" "Dad, help me, she's completely exhausted. I think she was left to starve." Mr. Peter immediately helped Daniel place Miss Mary onto the couch near the fireplace. Emma hurried to bring warm water, gently pressing it to Mrs. Mary's lips. "Grandma, please try to drink a little. It will make you feel better." Mrs. Mary slowly opened her eyes, gazing weakly at the young girl. Who are you?" Emma smiled gently. "I'm Emma. Don't worry, you're safe now." Daniel stood nearby, his heart aching. "Mom, I'm sorry," he whispered, but Mrs. Mary simply closed her eyes, saying nothing. Mr. Peter observed everything, then turned to Daniel. "Tell me what happened." Daniel swallowed hard, shame filling his chest. My siblings abandoned her in an old house in the middle of the forest. They didn't want to take care of her anymore." Emma gasped. "What, they just left her there?" Daniel nodded, his voice trembling, and I didn't stop them. Mr. Peter clenched his fists. Those heartless bastards. Emma looked at Daniel, her expression a mix of anger and pity. Do you even realize what she's been through? If you hadn't come in time, she could have died out there. Daniel lowered his head, unable to respond. Emma turned toward Mrs. Mary, her heart aching at the frail woman's state. Grandma, do you have any other relatives? I can help you contact them. Mrs. Marr slowly opened her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. No, I only have them. Them, the very children who had abandoned her. Emma took a deep breath before turning to her father. Dad, I can't let this go. Mr. Peter nodded. You're right. We need to bring this to light. Daniel looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What do you mean? Mr. Peter crossed his arms, his expression firm. I'm a lawyer, and I won't let those ungrateful children get away with this. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He had failed to protect his mother, but now he couldn't ignore this any longer. He nodded. I'll help you. Emma smiled. Then we start tomorrow. She turned back to Mrs. Mary, gently holding her frail hands. Grandma, you're not alone anymore. Mrs. Mary looked at her, and suddenly her eyes glistened with tears. For the first time in years she felt like someone truly cared. She squeezed Emma's hand, a small glimmer of hope shining through the darkness that had consumed her life. She was no longer abandoned. The darkness had passed, the light had come. The next morning the sky over Evergreen was clearer than it had been in a long time. Soft rays of sunlight filtered through Emma's window, warming the small but welcoming home. Mrs. Mary felt stronger after a night of care. For the first time in days she felt a little peace in her heart, but she knew the nightmare wasn't over yet. Daniel sat at the dining table, his heart heavy. Across from him, Mr. Peter carefully reviewed legal documents and laws regarding elder abandonment. He set his pen down and looked straight at Daniel. Are you ready to testify? Daniel clenched his fists. You mean sue them? Mr. Peter nodded. What your siblings did isn't just cruel, it's illegal under us law. Abandoning an elderly parent without proper care can be prosecuted in court. Daniel swallowed hard. He had known this moment would come, but hearing it from a lawyer made it all the more real. He knew Michael wouldn't let this go, but he also couldn't let his mother suffer injustice any longer. He nodded firmly. I'll do it. Emma smiled in satisfaction. Good, then let's get started right away. That afternoon Mr. Peter went to meet Mayor John Charles, a highly respected figure in the town. After hearing, I stayed silent when I should have stood up for you. I let Michael control me. I let my own cowardice cloud my judgment. His throat tightened. Mother, can you forgive me? Silence filled the air. Daniel didn't dare look up. He was afraid of seeing disappointment in her eyes, but then he felt a trembling hand gently rest on his head. He looked up. Mrs. Mary was gazing at him, her eyes filled with warmth and love. My son, she whispered, you came back. That is what matters most. Daniel broke into tears. The next morning Daniel made a decision. He would bring his mother back to town, not to the old house, the place that held too many painful memories, but to a new home. I bought this house, Daniel said, as they stood in front of a small home near the town center. I want you to have a better place to live. Mrs. Mary was so overwhelmed that she couldn't find the words to speak. Emma gently took her hand. I'll visit you often. You're not alone anymore. Daniel smiled. You will never have to fear being abandoned again. Mrs. Mary looked at the two people in front of her. One was the son she had once been most disappointed in, but who had now found his way back. The other was a young woman, once a stranger, who had saved her in her darkest moment. She held both their hands tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks, but this time they were not tears of sorrow, they were tears of happiness. Meanwhile, Michael, Emily, Lucas, and Helen faced the harsh reality of their disgrace. The luxurious restaurant where Michael had once been a regular now refused to serve him. We do not welcome ungrateful children, the owner said bluntly, leaving Michael humiliated as he was forced to leave. Lucas and Emily found themselves ostracized by their former friends. No one wanted to associate with them after the scandal. Helen was forced to resign, losing both her reputation and her status. They had lost everything, not just money, but also respect. This was the price they had to pay. A month later, Mrs. Mary sat on the porch of her new home, gazing toward the distant horizon. Daniel stepped outside, carrying a cup of hot tea. Mother, it's cold. Mrs. Mary took it with a smile. Thank you, son. They sat together in comfortable silence, enjoying a peace she had not known for a long time. Emma soon arrived, carrying a basket of cookies. I made some cookies today. Would you like to try them? Mrs. Mary beamed. Of course, my dear. Emma's eyes widened. Did you just call me? Mrs. Mary smiled tenderly. Daughter, because to me you have done things that not everyone could do. Emma was deeply moved and hugged her tightly. Daniel smiled, feeling a weight Lift from his heart, at last he had found a way to make amends. Mrs. Mary was no longer alone. Those who had betrayed her had faced justice, and in the end light had triumphed over darkness. Mrs. Mary's story was a powerful lesson in filial piety, justice, and human kindness. It served as a reminder that parents are never a burden, they are the ones who have sacrificed everything to raise their children. Those who are ungrateful will ultimately face the consequences of their selfishness. At the same time, her story showed that while regret may come late, redemption is always possible. Most importantly, love and kindness can appear in the most unexpected places, just as Emma had shown Mrs. Mary when she needed it most. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.